Hello, I'm Suzanne Joachim. I'm the OER coordinator for Butte Community College in California. This presentation is about universal design and how OER can help us build courses for diverse students. I wanted to begin with this image because it's one where you can select your individuality. That's something that we as humans really like to do. It's also a good framework for universal design, which will help us build courses for many different individuals. The Universal Design Framework is a little bit different than accessibility, although universal design done well will always build accessible resources. Accessibility often becomes a focus on individual components for particular situations. For example, you can see here we have a situation where a person needs to go up a flight of stairs and they're carrying him up. Now, in one sense, that's a solution to a problem, but really it's not at all a solution. We could build ramps for wheelchairs, but the vision for universal design is that these ramps are not just for wheelchairs, they're also for folks with children in strollers, with wheeled baggage, etc. So you can see in the other image, we've built a lift to get folks up the stairs, and this is useful for many different people. That's the idea for universal design. How can we build things that are helpful for everybody? And universal design is something that's used in all sorts of fields, from architecture, web design, all sorts of engineering. Of course, we're going to talk about universal design for learning. One other last example, this is one of those classics that I just love, and so I wanted to share it, is the peeler in the center. So if you've ever used these peelers, they have a rubber grip and they're really quite comfortable to hold, especially compared to if you've used the old peelers with the metal handles that always pinch your hand and it's really quite painful. This peeler was designed for someone with arthritis, but really it's more comfortable for everybody. So again, the consideration is how can we build things that are useful for the most number of different people. One last example is captions. Now, we all know captions are a requirement so that deaf individuals can participate in the learning from videos. But 80% of people that use captions aren't deaf. These are useful for all sorts of people. For example, if a student is in a location that's very noisy and they can't hear the video, captions can really help with that. Or students that have learning disabilities and may have a hard time focusing on just audio, the text can help connect them to the video in an additional format. Students that are second language learners find these very helpful, as do pretty much all students in a field where, like in sciences, there's a lot of heavy vocabulary. That's the example on the right. If all I'm hearing is those words, I may not fully understand what's being said. Seeing the vocabulary words can be very helpful for students to learn the content. One last comment on captions. The image on the left is a reminder that auto captions are not good enough. Auto captions are a great place to start, but they can bring in inaccuracies that can be very confusing. Once you have the auto captions, you need to go through and correct them and make sure that they're accurate so that students are hearing and seeing the correct terms. So as I mentioned, universal design is used in many fields, and we're going to focus on universal design for learning. Universal design for learning has three components, and we're going to talk about each of these individually. The first one is multiple means of representation. That is giving students different ways to acquire information. For example, in addition to the textbook, also having videos or audios or interactives, different ways for students to learn the content. Multiple means of action and expression is giving students different ways to show what they've learned. So not just tests, but also essays and diagrams and other homework assignments where students can demonstrate mastery of the information. Finally, multiple means of engagement. That is giving students different ways to connect with the information, different ways to engage with the content. And this can tap into their background, their skill sets, just as a way to draw them in based on what they're bringing with them to the classroom. Now, this may sound like an awful lot of choice, and it sounds a bit chaotic at first. And so I want to just draw some clear lines about what we are and are not talking about. So we are talking about choice in how students learn and how students demonstrate what they've learned. What we are not talking about is choice in what students are learning. That's set by the course objectives, and this is not about changing the course objectives. It's also not about changing the rigor. This is not about making it an easier class. So same content, same rigor, but just different ways to get there. And that's really what that image is showing, right? So we're starting and ending at the same place. The only difference is how we got there. One example to kind of help with this is this diagram where they're trying to explain flowcharts using flowcharts. So I'm going to pause here, and you can pause the video to let this settle in. Okay. So this reminds me of kind of lecturing. So for some students, lecturing is a good way to learn information. But if it's not a good way for that particular student, then more different forms of lecturing isn't necessarily going to help, right? So if they don't understand how to use flowcharts, a flowchart's not going to help them learn how to do that. So how does this translate to actual content? Now, I teach biology, so my examples are all going to be relevant to biology, but these are really something that is universal across the board. So there's many different ways to explain things. In this example, one of the things that students learn is how proteins are made. And in the textbooks, there's generally some really nice paragraph format text, and there's some nice images. So these are two options that students often have in textbooks. And for me, I always connected more with the images. So when I first started teaching, I just assumed the images were the best way for people to learn. But I quickly realized that a lot of students just don't connect with this format of information, and the paragraphs are much more effective for them. There's also explaining things using outline format, so some students find this a lot easier to learn. There's also videos, which can be very helpful, and interactive. So this, you can't see the interactivity, but it's something that students click on and it gives them feedback. So there's lots of different ways for students to learn material, and I started realizing that why am I the one that chooses the best format? So when I was selecting textbooks for my classes, I was essentially picking textbooks that I thought had the most engaging text and the best pictures. And at one point I thought, you know, I want to get some student feedback on this. So I gave my class extra credit to go evaluate a bunch of different textbooks that I was considering, and my idea was I would pick the one that the most students liked for the next semester. Problem was, no textbook won. Every textbook had some students that loved it for whatever reason. The text was great, the images were great, whatever it might be, and some students that didn't like it because they didn't like the pictures or the text. And so what I started realizing is there was no best answer. Another situation that kind of really started bringing this home to me was, this was early on before there were open resources for biology. I was involved in writing some of the earlier texts. And so what we wanted to do is look at what if what we were creating was as effective as the traditional textbook. Now, what I had in my class was a traditional textbook that was, I think, $150 or so, and then this free online resource. And I didn't want to force students to have to buy the book or have to use the digital resource, so I gave them choice. I said, pick one of these, and at the end of the semester, I looked at their grades and I gave them some surveys about the resource they chose. What I found is that students did equally well regardless of the resource they chose. And many students actually picked both. And they picked both for very intentional reasons. So I was quite impressed in the students' ability to really think about what resource they're using and why. Now, a lot of them chose the online resource because it was free and finances are important. And that certainly is a relevant consideration. But they also chose the online resource because they could get to it at work, or it had some interactivity. Or they chose the paper resource because they needed that tactile format. And so students were really quite intentional about how they were selecting their resources. So I actually just kept giving them those options. Now, over time, the beauty of it was that there were more open resources. So you can see here students have a choice of 2 different textbooks. And both of these are free online, or we sell a low-cost print option at the bookstore. So they have their choice of online or paper. I also give them other choices. So these are some of these are more video-based or more interactive-based. And you can't see, there's a long list of videos down below. So at first glance, this seems like it could be really confusing for students. But what I found is that most students are incredibly appreciative of being given the option of selecting resources that work best for them. And again, I was quite impressed with the students' ability to pick resources for the right reasons. Now, I do have about maybe 1% of the students that find this a little confusing. And so what I tell them is the top textbook is the one that I would have picked if I only picked one. So that's the one that'll have all your answers. You don't have to use any of the rest of them, but if you're finding that there's a certain section that's a little confusing, maybe start dabbling down here and see if that helps. And after that explanation, the students get it and they're quite settled with this format. Now there is one additional piece to this, and that is it's not, again, not a free-for-all. I give them a very specific list of what they need to know. So on the other side here is my study guide, and it tells them exactly what they need to know. The other reason for this is I also want students to start to get past the idea of biology is learning things in this tome, right? And so they end up with this vision of this week we are learning chapter 3. And really what I want them to get more out of the course is how do I answer biological questions? So if I'm at the doctor's office and I'm being told something about a condition, where do I find that information? Or if there's a bill that I'm supposed to vote on or some sort of legislation that I'm voting on, where can I get informed so that I know what I'm voting on? So digital literacy, information literacy in biology is one of my main goals for the class. And so this can help support that because what I'm giving them is questions. Here's the question that you're trying to answer, and then they can go find the answer in multiple different formats. We also in the course, and this isn't shown here, but we also talk a lot about where do you go find good information. So there's a large component of the course where they evaluate the resources that they're using to make sure that they're getting the right information. So that's multiple means of representation. Multiple means of action and expression is giving students different ways to demonstrate mastery. Now, tests are one way to show what students have learned, but I think it's important for us to consider what are we really testing. So the question in the box is a test question that I've used for many years, and I loved it. This was my absolute favorite question because it really requires students to understand the content in order to be able to answer it. So there is a critical thinking component with this. The problem is a lot of students were missing it not because they didn't understand the content, but because they didn't understand the format of the question. So those of us that are used to SATs and GREs and all this sort of thing, we're used to this kind of question. This makes sense, what's being asked. But for a lot of students, the question itself is nonsense, and so they couldn't answer the question. Now, a big part of that is writing better questions, and I've gotten better at that over the years. But it's also considering maybe there's another way to assess student knowledge. So let me give you an example. On the screen there is one of the units in our course where we talk about all the macromolecules of life. And so there's 4 groups of macromolecules. There's all these different chemicals in the groups. We talk about what each of them is and you know, what they look like, what they're used for, and so on. And so really what I want to assess is do students understand what each of these things is and how they're grouped? Now, there's a lot of different ways for students to show that. And so in the assignment, I tell students that you can do whatever you like. I just want to know that you can show me how they're grouped and what they are. This is an assignment I use throughout the class for many different topics. And so early on, I give them examples. You know, you can use mind maps, flowcharts, flashcards, etc. Later in the semester, they start understanding that they can choose whatever works for them, and they start getting a little more creative. Some examples of student responses. You can see here on the right is a mind map, and this is just a small piece of it. But you can see the student has grouped the content, they've defined it, and this is a really great way to answer that question. Upper left, another great way to answer it. It's more of an outline, but again, they've defined and grouped the terms. Down below, the student selected to define and group separately. So this table was how they grouped the terms, and then they defined them on flashcards. And that's another valid way to learn the content. Now, what's particularly interesting about this is, again, students are surprisingly intentional about how they're doing these assignments. When I first started doing this, I noticed that just on their own, without me leading or guiding this, students started having these discussions about, how did you answer this question? Why did you answer it this way? I did flashcards, and here's why it worked or didn't work. And so they started having these really deep discussions about study strategies, just all on their own. Now, I've actually wrapped this into the assignment. So after the second assignment, I require students to analyze what they chose, why they chose, and if it's working, and then have those discussions. And after some of the later assignments, maybe 4 or 5 down the road, I have them do that and then also pick another strategy and answer the question again, so that they're starting to see that they can do different things, and maybe there's advantages and disadvantages. So these are study skills that they're going to carry on with them in addition to the scientific knowledge that they're gaining. Now, one of the advantages we have is that there are a world of really wonderful free tools online. So in the upper right is an example of a resource where students can create online flashcards, and it's a little more gamified, but it gets at the same sort of information. So when I was designing these assignments, I wanted to give students more tools. So I wanted to give them all of these online tools, but I started realizing that there is so many tools, and it was starting to get a little overwhelming for me. So I created a website, and this is very early stages. It's really just bare bones. But my thought was I wanted to put together all the different tools for mind mapping and all the different tools for flashcards and infographics and so on. And maybe as a community we can come together and start rating these tools so that when we need a particular resource, we have an easy place to go find it. So the website is Rula@weebly.com, which is a free tool for creating websites. And Rula stands for Review of Online Learning Aids, because acronyms are the only way to go if you've been in academia for a while. And you can see here is a list of all the different mind mapping tools. These are some drawing tools. And I actually give students the link to this site and tell them, there's all these great resources that you can use. Pick one that you like. And this kind of empowers them to understand that I'm not going to give them the tools they need. They have the tools, and they're just going to find them on their own. Well, I support them in it, but they have to find the tool that works best for them. So that's multiple means of expression. And I should mention that I have done some assessments of student grades, and these changes all happened slowly over time, so it's hard to tell exactly what change caused what result. But I have noticed that student grades have been improving, and that students are much more engaged in the course. So the feedback is much more positive. And so these are effective strategies, at least for my courses and my students. So multiple means of engagement. How do we tap into the student's background so that they can bring their background to the course and give them something to connect with, give them a way to engage with the content? One way to do that is to have students collaboratively within the course create content, right? So this is called open pedagogy. One way to do that is to have students create quiz questions or actual course content. A simpler format is to have students discuss which resources work well for what study guide question. So this is, again, the website that I've created as an example. What I have students do, and I didn't have enough of this to really show on the screen here, but what I have students do is rate each of the videos or textbook choices that they have and discuss what study guide question it answers, if it was helpful, if there's something that was missing. And so it's more of a discussion format, but they start having these discussions about what resources work well. Now, what I'd like to do in the future is create something like what I've shown here, where each of the resources for the class is listed, and then the student reviews are listed on the right side. I haven't quite gotten there. Now, there's a couple of different resources for reviewing. So this right here is called Power. It's a free resource. Google also has the little +1 resource. So there's ways to do this. It's a little bit more complicated, but nonetheless, the point here is having students share what they're learning and how they're learning is really a powerful way for them to engage with the content. Another way to do this is what I call community service. Now, this has a couple of different functions. One is, again, information and digital literacy. I want students to really understand that not everything online is correct. And we all get that, and I think students get that, but it's hard to connect, well, what is and what isn't. So what I have them do is go to something like Yahoo Answers or Ask.com or the other sites like that and type in a question. So I typed in, what is global warming? And you can see here the best answer with a little gold trophy. And you can pause and read this if you like. It's quite surprising. So the best answer is really a terrible answer. And so we discuss, how do you know this is a good answer? How do you, go to other sites and validate what they're saying? How do you know sites are valid? But the next step is having students actually answer the question. And the reason I like that is it really gives students a feeling of empowerment. They are no longer just the passive recipients of knowledge. They are actually the ones teaching and sharing knowledge and creating, educational content. And so that idea of empowerment really is a good way to engage student with the information. It's also a good way for, a lot of our students don't necessarily feel like they're part of the academic world. And this is a nice way to show them that, yes, they are, and they can be part of that academic world. Another example of this is a lot of my assignments allow for drawings. And so I let students know, you can share these drawings in something like Wikimedia Commons, and there's a lot of places to do that. But you can share these, and it'll always be associated with your name, depending on how you set the license. And this is, again, another way that students can be empowered to share content. Now, students don't have to be artists, right? There's all sorts of, again, tools to help them draw or create infographics. And again, this is another way for students to really start connecting how information is shared. So that was a lot of examples, a lot of ideas. And I just want to take us back to the beginning. Really, the point of this presentation, and I think the core idea of universal design, is to think about how can we connect our information, our content, to the most different types of students, different individuals. How can we bring them all in so that they have a way to engage with the information?